All right, this is round 2 of recording this video. I literally just threw 30 minutes in the trash, so I'm going to try to make this faster, more succinct, and get to the point more directly. Whether you hated it or loved it, Season 10 is without question one of the most popular and successful seasons for Diablo 4. And people will point to a lot of different things that may have been the cause here. Better build diversity through the chaos powers, better build diversity through what items could enable, just generally more powerful. The rate of acquiring power was generally faster. There are a lot of things, and whether or not those things are good for you is going to paint whether or not you liked the season or not. But I think that the whiplash that we're experiencing going from Season 10 in its current state to testing out Season 11 points to a much more nefarious and gross disease state that Diablo 4 has been experiencing since Season 2, and it's something that I have fought against the entire time. And maybe, just maybe, with the experience that we've had in Season 11, we can finally really shine a light on this, and what possibly could be this insidious of a problem that I would hype it up this much. Well, it's unique items. And you might think, well, of course, Mac, being able to apply all these different chaos uniques made the entire build. It was awesome. It was so great being able to equip stuff. No. That's actually not what I'm talking about. It is whether or not your unique item fixes your build or doesn't. We're going to highlight Kroor's Embrace, and most notably the Blood Surge Necromancer. If you've never played that class, I'm going to give a quick rundown about how it works mechanically. So if you already know that, you can skip ahead. You're not going to offend me. But I think that if you really want to know the whole story here, I wouldn't skip ahead too quickly. Wait just a quick second and let me try to show you what I'm talking about. But when we're talking about unique items for builds, what we're generally talking about is something that defines the best in slot version of it. But you could typically be using legendary gear before that. With Blood Surge, this isn't really true. The build effectively doesn't work until you equip these gloves, and it's not immediately apparent why. So let's give a quick rundown of how Blood Surge works. Blood Surge has 2 different damage components. First, it's going to drain every enemy on the screen, and that's going to let out a Nova in a close area around you. The Nova's damage is increased by a multiplier, up to 50%, based off of how many targets were drained by the Drain effect. The Drain effect does hip squeak damage in comparison to the Nova damage, especially when you consider this damage multiplier on top of it. In our example, the Drain does 54% weapon damage, and the Nova does 216% weapon damage, and we're just assuming that you have drained up to the maximum. You have drained 10 targets, giving it a 50% damage multiplier. That's how we get up to 324. And when you do the math, it turns out that the drain is only representative of 15% of the total damage that the attack does. So okay, great, when we're building Blood Surge, we care about the Nova, we care about scaling the Nova, that's what we really care about. The drain's not super important. And that's where aspects like Bloodbathed come in. Bloodbathed says that your Nova is going to echo, and it's going to do 90% or dealing 10% less damage. So it's like having a 1.9 times multiplier on a one-hitter, and that's pretty insane. But to get a more accurate representation of it, you have to recognize what portion of the skill use damage it represents. Because if the drain is 15% of the damage, then the Nova is actually only 85% of the damage. That means that if you take the 90% damage multiplied by the actual percentage of total damage, Bloodbathed still ends up being a 77% damage multiplier. That's absolutely nutty. Now, it does have a limitation, though, because putting this onto a two-hander just cuts that number in half. So you go from doing 90% damage to 95% damage. So it kind of has this give and take. It is arguably one of the most powerful one-handed weapon aspects, meaning that you don't have to put it onto your amulet or a two-hander, but also that you can't put it onto a one-hander or a two-hander to actually realistically increase how much damage you're getting out of it. But what does Kroor's Embrace do to this system? How does it impact it? How does it change this balance? Well, with the more drains that we get, even against a single target like against a boss, that means that the drain damage actually starts to represent a majority of our damage, and it changes this relationship with our best aspect, actually losing its value. Because Kroor's Embrace says that you will drain 8 additional times from an elite. So you drain the first time, then you drain them 8 more times. And each time that you drain, you do damage. And not only that, you're going to increase the multiplier for the Nova's damage at the end. So if we're draining from a target 9 times, we just take our drain damage, multiply it by 9. In this example, since I'm only draining 9 times, not the 10, we do very slightly change the Nova's damage to reduce it by that multiplier. And we end up getting this much as our total damage. More than 2 times our total damage, and you'll notice that the drain is now representative of the majority. The drain is doing 60% of our damage, and the Nova is only doing 40% of our damage. And because the Nova is only representative of 40% of the damage output of the build, that means that the Bloodbathe aspect ends up only being representative of a 35% damage multiplier. This is one of the only places where putting on a unique item, which doubles your damage, actually cuts the benefit that you get out of one of your aspects in half. That's actually very funny. The sad part being that Blood Surge doesn't have a different multiplier to put into the slot, so even though our best aspect is now only a 35% damage multiplier, we just still have to use it. Now, there is some minor upside of getting an additional Nova, means that you proc Lucky Hit chance more often, you hit more targets, etc. So it's not completely wasted, it's actually slightly higher than this value, but this is just the on-paper effectiveness. It's so weird that making your build stronger makes your aspect worse for your build. So now that we understand the impact of Korra's Embrace, let's really side-by-side compare your legendary gloves you'd be able to put on another aspect onto here, get even more damage scaling, and how that really ranks up against this unique item, which not only is fundamentally changing the functionality of the build, enabling it to continue to be able to scale damage against a single target, whereas previously it couldn't before, but how does it impact damage in comparison to an alternative? So if we were to take the perfect Blood Surge gloves, GA on Blood Surge, triple Masterwork crit, get the attack speed and the blood attack speed, add on another damage multiplier, the damage ends up looking something like this. Your drain damage multiplied by 1, we're only draining once per cast. We get a 60% damage multiplier from Tides of Blood, which is a passive that's relevant to the total damage calculation here, so I didn't want to paint an incomplete picture. And then the new damage multiplier of Cadaverous. We're only draining once, so the multiplier we get is only 5%. This is our Nova damage, this is our Bloodbathe damage, and our total damage is 1000% weapon damage. Looking over at Korra's Embrace, in the exact same season, comparing it with the same likelihood of getting a GA and a triple Masterwork on the stat that you want. Your drains are almost nearly all of that damage combined because it's a slightly lower base damage because we actually get 1 less rank to Blood Surge, but multiplied by 9, Tides of Blood is a 2x multiplier here. We get a 45% multiplier on the Nova. Nova is this much damage, Bloodbathe is this much damage, and our total damage is 2 times our previous damage. 2 times our previous damage, regardless of the combat scenario, because now we can actually drain enough times against a single target or a boss, be able to net nearly the exact same amount of damage multiplication that we would in a horde of monsters. The drains are representative of a huge amount of the damage here and are carrying a lot of the weight, and we are doing 2x damage. So it functionally fixes Blood Surge, and it's the strongest damage multiplier you can have on the build. That's where we start to run into an issue, and we see this across other builds as well. Without trying to bore you to death, and I'm not going to do all the math for you here, Ebon Piercer is representative of a similar issue of Korra's Embrace. If you were to do the math of how much damage these little bolts that do damage for 3 seconds is in comparison to the amount of damage you can get out of a fully scaled Blight Bolt, ends up being Blight doing about 5% of the build's damage. Quite literally, this amulet, ignoring the stats on top, like actually ignore those entirely. The Ranked Reaper's Pursuit, the passive skills, ignore all of that. The amulet is representative of 95% of the damage output of a Blight build because the amount of damage that the Blight skill does in comparison to these little dots is minuscule. So you have to equip this amulet. Because you have to equip this amulet means you don't get to equip other amulets. Amulets that can have percentage core stats, multiple passive ranks, a huge damage multiplier on them as well, tempers to boot. Nope. You have to use Ebon Piercer, because the amount of damage that you would do without Ebon Piercer pales in comparison to with Ebon Piercer. Mutilator Plate is the same issue for Bloodlance. Mutilator Plate fixes Bloodlance. The long and short of Bloodlance is that, similar to Blood Surge, it only does damage if it has multiple targets to hit. That's how it actually gains efficiency and actually scales its damage from its strongest aspect, which is called Bloodseekers. Bloodseeker says you do more damage per target that is currently lanced. Mutilator Plate makes it so that you are lanced. It helps you to generate blood orbs, which you need to be able to trigger overpower. Gives you a damage multiplier for Blood Lance already, so you already can't kind of question it. You just have to. Has chance for Blood Lance to deal double damage with a GA on it in Masterworks. That means that you could put other tempers onto your weapons. It gives you a huge amount of damage reduction, ranks to Blood Lance, and back in the day when Overpower gained damage from maximum life, the huge amount of maximum life here was a massive scaler of your damage too. But what that means is that Blood Lance can't equip Shroud of False Death. And just a quick sneak peek here, if you can't equip Shroud of False Death in Season 11 as it currently stands, you actually can't activate all of the nodes in your Paragon boards because of the amount of, for the Necromancer, like dexterity and willpower that you need. Shroud of False Death is the only way to get there. So if you can't equip this item, you are losing out on insane amounts of survivability and damage. But because Mutilator Plate fixes the functionality of Blood Lance and scales its damage, you have to wear it. There are no alternatives. The story is almost completely different with things like Bone Spear. Bone Spear is going to use Deathless Visage. Now, Deathless Visage is the strongest damage scaler for Bone Spear because it has maximum resource, which you want, chance for Bone Spear to cast twice, huge ranks to Bone Spear, and then a damage multiplier. But what you'll notice is that the stats on top aren't really build enabling. They are good stats for Bone Spear, but none of them say Bone Spear now works. The aspect also is just a damage scaler of Bone Spear. It doesn't really differently change its functionality. It very slightly adds on additional lucky hit chance procs from the explosions from the echoes, but you can actually make an argument for using this versus using Shaco versus using Air of Perdition based off of what your build needs at any given time. And if a new unique helmet comes out, you could potentially use that one as well. This one doesn't fix Bone Spear, it just happens to be the best in slot based off how much it scales its damage. And because none of this is tied to the aspects have all, at least at this point, been unchanged in the Season 11 PTR, but instead the affixes on the piece of gear itself, that means that the impact of the Masterwork changes that are coming in Season 11 disproportionately impact builds like this. In Season 10, this is what an item looks like. The long and short of the Masterwork changes is that instead of critting on a stat and increasing it by 50%, you're instead going to just add another GA to your piece of gear. So a 1 GA item will become a 2 GA item, which is a 50% increase on one of your stats. But the other thing that Masterworking did was increase all of your stats incrementally. So you'll see here, even though I got 2 GAs on Bone Spirit cooldown and on 1 GA on Corpse Tendril size, the ranks to compound fractures on this item still went from 2 to 3 because they in total got about 50% increase from incrementally increasing. So the idea that Masterworking would evenly and equally reduce the power of builds on paper makes sense. Every build is going to need a bit more attack speed and a bit more crit chance to be able to hit caps. They're getting less core stat, which reduces, for the Necromancer, survivability and damage output. You're also not going to get these crazy outcomes where you get like +8 ranks to passives, but every build is losing that, except for the builds that have to equip unique items, and those unique items are stats. What I have for you here is a comparison against these same Crew's Embrace that we were comparing down here from Season 10 versus what they'll look like in Season 11. Just simply losing out on some maximum life here. Funnily enough, a GA on Tides of Blood equals how many ranks you would get in the current system, because you get 2 and then you increase it by 50%. Just from ranking it up 12 times without actually masterworking on it. So you end up at 3. And then the biggest change here is obviously the number of drains. We go from draining +8 times to only being able to drain +4 times. And even a little bit more salt in the wound here. The ranks to Blood Surge being at +5, going all the way up to +7 without Masterwork critting on them, means that we only get +5 over here. So we're going to do less base damage. We're going to drain less often. We're going to get the same number of passives and be less tanky. Well, the biggest difference here is going to be between the drains, right? Drains over here represent 936 damage. Drains over here represent 500. And if you do all the math out, what it ends up being is that in Season 10, Crew Wars Embrace are 40% stronger than they'll be in Season 11, meaning that the build Blood Surge is going to be doing 70% of its previous damage from this one item alone. Oddly enough, that is a disproportionate impact from the changes to Masterworking. And I'm going to wrap all that up in a bow and say that it's not inherently bad. I just need the developers to be aware of this. And I'm not even arguing that they aren't aware, but I'm hoping that they are bringing this level of scrutiny to each individual build and not painting with wide brushstrokes here. I've argued for a long time that unique items in Diablo 4 are fundamentally flawed. They do not represent a unique approach to playing the game. They represent the best in slot, most meta version of playing the game. They're effectively one item sets. And the more items that you have like this on a build that empower it, the more paint by colors it becomes, and worse the build feels without them. Regardless of how much we kick and scream, Ring of Men Down is the item that enables minion builds to be able to do damage. Now, in Season 11, with the change over to the new Gravebloom mace, which makes it so you can run a Golem build, Golem doesn't use Ring of Men Down, which is pretty sick. But Hand of Nas Mages is going to use Ring of Men Down, and if you just run a full zoo of all of your minions, they will use Ring of Men Down. You can't get away from this item, and because this item exists, they can't then go buff everything else, because then it would be imbalanced. Take Kurora's Embrace as an example here as this last point, and look at the different things that could be changed about a skill that can't because this item exists. Looking at the skill on face value, I think it's pretty easy to see why there is some issue here. It is an AoE skill. In the moment that you have less monsters, you get less multiplier on your Nova damage. If they wanted to, they could bump up how much of a damage multiplier your Drain offers, right? It could be that your Drain grants you 25% damage per target drained up to a cap of 100% damage. Well, this is kind of okay because it's more damage than it was strictly before, and it doesn't scale drastically differently. But because Kurora's Embrace exists, just equipping that even against a single target, you're going to do 2x damage on your Nova. Maybe that's okay, but if we have this multiplier and Kurora's Embrace exists, we can never address anything else in it. Like maybe it turns out that the AoE damage of Blood Surge doesn't really stack up as the game gets harder and harder and you progress later and later. The only way to really do better AoE damage is either to pull everything together so it's not even AoE damage, or to make the Drains do more damage. If the Drains did more damage, it would be a better tool for clearing AoE and probably wouldn't drastically change its output against a single target. With Kurora's Embrace draining as many times as it does, you are more hesitant to increase the base drain damage because it will scale out of control with this item. Everything that we have for the economy of power across the game, from our Paragon to our gear to what Masterworking allows to the seasonal powers, has to be taken in consideration to the base skills themselves. And I don't know if you've ever done something like construction, but I'm going to use an example here of like trying to pave a driveway. Do you know that when you pave driveways or when you build homes, you have to slant things away because rain happens, right? Snow happens. You don't want water to all sink into the foundation of a house. So when you make a driveway, you don't want a driveway to be completely flat because all the water will settle and then it will naturally seep into whatever it can. Typically, the foundation of your house is more porous than the asphalt. So when you take a driveway, you want it to be very slightly slanted. But how much you slant a driveway has drastic ramifications because a little change up here translates to a massive difference down here. The same thing applies in a system like this, except where the rain's coming from and the ways that we need to slant the builds so that everything isn't getting flooded are significantly more complex. So anything you put somewhere into the game is naturally limiting the things that you can do elsewhere in the game for balance. And by tying these skills to items that functionally solve their issues and then simultaneously lead to damage scaling is a natural limiter or near hard cap on what you're able to do outside of this item's existence, because a person can just as easily go get this and put it on and experience that insane power. And that has been my major issue with Uniques this entire time. They're always the best in slot, and they keep being used as bandages for solving the problems of skills, as opposed to the skills themselves being functional and powerful without them. So what is my message here? Well, oddly enough, I've already shared a lot of this feedback now for years with the developers, and with the Season 11 PTR shining such a stark light on this, I really empowered my argument for Uniques needing to be reinvestigated, skills themselves need to be reinvestigated, and a very fine-tooth comb being used in the approach to game balance, understanding that the changes, while universal, are not equally universal across the board. Each build is drastically changed in different ways based off of how many stats exist on gear, or how much Paragon they need to use for survivability versus damage, versus the types of aspects they're going to have to use to survive things they otherwise wouldn't before. And this is good, ultimately, for the health of the game. And I believe, oh, hey, I just realized Randall Flagg is here. Shout out to Randall Flagg. No spoilers if you haven't read it, but Randall Flagg is lame as hell. He's a really bad villain. I hate what King did with him. Back to the point at hand, though. The whole issue here is that the game needed to be reinvestigated because a lot of these balance issues have been here for a long time. It negatively impacts people's ability to just play their favorite build and go do all the content in the game. And hopefully the severity of the changes in this Season 11 PTR, if you notice, that didn't come hand in hand with really any altogether buffs for the majority of classes or skills, is just because they needed to see the fallout. And now we can take all these builds, see what they did, and go, oh no, these guys are garbage. Let's go ahead and bump up those numbers. I'd like to see core functionality of Uniques and aspects be brought into the skills themselves, and not have to rely on finding a unique item just to play the build, but instead finding a unique item to empower the build. A great example is something like Poison Nova from Diablo 2. You could play a Poison Nova Necro before you have Death's Web. It is weak, but you can do it. If you get Death's Web, it is now powerful enough where the build feels good. I would like to see that a little less stark there, where there are good versions of builds before you have these items, and then better versions of builds after you have them, as opposed to the build doesn't exist until you have it. There you go. That was shorter and sweeter because I only got through half of the stuff I wanted to talk to in that first recording. So hopefully you can appreciate that. Or maybe if you just wanted to watch the longer form content, I've been on a bit of a kick of this and people seem to be responding well to it. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You don't want to miss out on any of this deep depth, just real MacroBioBoi Excel sheet nonsense that I do for this video game. And if you like the video, please leave a like on it and leave a comment down below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that there's something I missed here? Do you think that I was spot on? Do you just have other things that you want to complain about? How's your day going? Did you get that tea that you promised that you would make yourself this morning? I did, and I was actually pretty proud of myself. So let me be proud of you too. That's enough of me yapping though. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.